Okay, can folks on Zoom hear us?
Yes.
Excellent. Yeah, we'll have a little bit of an echo. All right, so you can tell it's summertime. It's a good thing we don't need a quorum for these meetings. I know. All right, so welcome everybody to the June meeting of the Housing Task Force. This is going to be a little bit different. We have traditionally had presenters. That's really annoying. Which we're not going to do today. I'm sort of going to do a little bit of a presentation. The two agenda items that we've got today are a little bit larger. One is very large. One I think will go pretty quick. That's true. That's true. But it seems like a real betrayal to then say that I'll be a presenter.
Yeah, but it's not. This is a great idea, alternating presentation with a real discussion.
A little more of a workshop this time around. So the first item that we've gotten here.
Chris, excuse me. We can only see you and half of Ron Knott. Is there anybody else there?
What was the problem, Keith?
We can only see you and half of Ron Knott. I was wondering if anybody else was in the room.
Oh, yeah, we've got Kelly Sweet, Meredith Kane, and then Tim and Ron, and then me.
Okay.
And some folks on Zoom. All right, so our first agenda item is the employer survey that we've been working on for a little bit. The initial draft of this was put together by Dr. Tim Wilmot, excuse me, from the Berkshire Taconic Foundation. Kelly was nice enough to facilitate that connection for us, and Dr. Wilmot put together a really good initial draft that was circulated here in our office. Jessica Gabriel took a look at it. It was sent over to Chris Nardone, who is also on the Housing Task Force Advisory Board, who does workforce for both Columbia and Greene counties. He had some feedback as well. And then the outreach committee took a look at it a few weeks ago, and that feedback is compiled here. So really what the aim of this survey is, it's to give a voice to employers who are often referred to in a lot of the housing reports and a lot of housing presentations that we see in here. We don't typically hear directly from employers that often, so that's what this is for. But just to make sure that we're collecting information that is relevant and vital, information that we can do something with, that's what this little review period is for. And once we've kind of collected all this feedback, we'll send it back to Dr. Wilmot, and then we'll get a finished product. So some of this is really simple, right? What is the name of your business? Oh, for the folks at home, I cannot share this. One moment. So again, this is boilerplate. What is the name of your business? In which Columbia County, basically municipality, city, town, village, is your business located? And then it gets into really kind of specific housing questions. I think question number 4 probably had the most comments about it, so we'll drill down on that one a little bit. So we've got, what is the name of your business? In which municipality does your business operate? What is the extent of your concern about housing affordability? And some of these have boxes where people can kind of fill in narrative descriptions, which is great. And some of these, the options are, housing affordability has affected me by having difficulty recruiting new employees, retaining current employees, employees were priced out. So these are the ones that we really want to drill down. These are a lot of options. People obviously can check more than one box. Some of these might be a little too subjective, and I think that was the tenor of a lot of the feedback that we've received so far. So if we go through, we'll just go one by one, the comments that we've had so far. So Jessica, right off the bat, wanted to add number of employees as a question, just to get an extent of how big this business is, how many employees are affected. It's not currently on here. She would like to add industry. That's a little bit for data collection for our sake as well. It's a little bit more relevant and more impactful to know which industries are being the most affected. Wordsmith question 3 was a bit of her feedback. We wanted to just potentially get rid of Columbia County based. So instead of to what extent is housing affordability a concern for you as an owner manager of a blah, 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 it would just be public business. So just take out the Columbia County base there. And then specifically, she wanted the top three. So if you look at question 4 on the right column, the top 3 options. And this, again, the question is, how does housing affordability affect your business and or employees? So these answers were, it makes employees less productive when they are working. It has contributed to absenteeism and has caused employees health concerns. So one of the options was, instead of just removing those 3 entirely, having them as parenthetical examples of ways that housing affordability is impacting your business in this much more open-ended question towards the end, right? So 6 and 7 are both pretty open-ended questions. So the idea was, for number 7, the question is there anything else you would like to share with us on how the cost and availability of housing in Columbia County, yada, yada. At the end of that, in parentheses, add those 3 options from the from that question 4. So that question would then read, is there anything else you'd like to share with us? Blah, blah, blah. Right after employees, parenthetical, for example, it makes employees less productive, comma, has contributed to absenteeism, etc.
So, I think this is good. A couple of other thoughts.
Yeah.
Should we ask them, as between ownership housing and rental housing, which do you think is the better option, or which do you think your employees would prefer?
Getting into employee preferences.
Or which do you think would be more useful for your employees?
Yeah, or they could just ask their employees, you know, what types of housing are your employees looking for? Right, something like that.
That's great. I know.
Yeah, that's second level, right? So it's going to start at employers, and then a second level later on will be employee one.
Right. And I wonder if there's a way to ask the question about rents or monthly payments, because effectively you're sort of backwards with asking about how much to pay their fees. But I think it would be really helpful to know. You know, if you say, if you give an example, 30% of gross annual income is, you know, what someone's supposed to pay in rent or housing expense. What is the range of housing costs that you think your employees can pay? I would love to see an answer to that.
Yes, yeah, well, that would be interesting. Yeah, it feels like yeah, I don't. That's the thing. Yeah, I feel the more specific you get.
Chris, excuse me, we're not able to hear any of the participants beside you.
Yeah.
It's like optional.
I mean, they're all optional, right?
Yeah.
You can say it's just get a gauge for what they think rent should be. House for $1,000 a month. Yeah.
Right. If there's some kind of disconnect between,
But they think that people should be getting.
right, which, you know, kind of ties into, well, no, I'm paying a fair wage. I mean, I don't want to get into, you know, issues of pay equity and fair wages and things like that with the survey. I think the more specific that we get.
What affordability is, and you can also tell them, you know, kind of charging for the even on something without subsidy. But it would be very interesting to get a sense of perception about how actual housing costs in the area and affordability differ from what people think, you know, affordability is what they should be paying. So maybe Kelly, the way you described it is a good way to raise it. What do you think? What do you think people can afford to pay?
All right. That's a war.
Right.
Monthly housing.
Okay. Oh. Keith?
We're unable to hear any of the participants other than you.
Kelly, say something.
Better?
Better?
No.
Better.
Oh.
No.
Should
If I
be.
project a little bit.
Better now? Do you guys want to try? Oh, why are my cameras off? Yeah.
Well, on the camera.
Turn over my lights then.
That's one too. I was saying What do you think employees should
Good
pay
move.
for monthly housing?
Yeah.
Was it fine before?
No, it's not been good at all. It's just, yeah, unfortunately.
Interesting.
I think these mics are not on. I think these mics are not on.
Should go on with, yeah.
Does everybody have a microphone, or are they near a microphone?
They're near us.
Chris, unfortunately, I think you have to turn up the sound too, so we can hear. We can hear the screen, even though we'll hear you twice.
Yeah, but I don't think he's gonna help people at home. No, these should be on as the cameras come on. Joyce?
I was wondering, I haven't seen this survey, I'm sorry, but on the employees, number of employees, would you also want to know the target number that they need as opposed to the number they have?
Yes, so are they understaffed because of housing issues? Yeah, and I think we have that in here, but we can certainly drill down and make that a much more explicit question or a specific question. Okay, so that was Jessica's feedback. Chris Nardone's feedback. I think the survey is good. Don't have much to add on top of the suggestions in the previous email. That's a reference to Jessica's comments. He likes the top 3 responses, and those are the ones from those boxes. Those are the ones we're talking about adding to the end of question 7. I do like this point. I think it could be useful to see if managers / business owners are hearing those things from their employees, but I also understand why you might want to cut them. So that's more of a conversation between the employers and the employees. I think that's the next level to this survey. And I think, Ron, to your point, if we make this really specific, or even if it gets into conversations that are a little bit awkward, I think we're less likely to see a decent slate of responses. Also, Chris said, I would be interested to ask if managers / owners would support development of affordable / workforce housing in the cities, towns, villages. And then he says, but this isn't really the place for that. I actually think that that's a great question to ask.
Yeah.
Would you support? And then if so, how? Give them a little box so that they can fill in a response to that. So I think adding that is because then you're starting to build a coalition of employers who are, are interested in housing, or at least have stated that they are. So then Chris's other suggestion, maybe leave the 3 check boxes in, but we're doing that, right? So those are all Chris's. Outreach committee, we had a couple of grammar things, just replacing a couple of misspellings and a couple of syntax issues. Childcare questions came up during outreach committee, and that absolutely, I think, should be included. We know that childcare is a huge issue throughout the county and actually throughout the region. Starting to become an issue throughout the state, and childcare and employment opportunities are really intrinsically intertwined. So I think that we should somehow get childcare into this survey.
I agree that it's a really important issue, but it's a whole separate.
It's another ball of wax.
It really is. I don't want to mix this up too much.
You're asking employers this. You talked about phase 2, where we talk to the employees, maybe focus that more.
Childcare is the employee survey.
I mean,
Or just ask them if they provide childcare, just to direct to that employer one-to-one, and maybe you'll get a data point out of it. Of respondents provide childcare.
yeah, you could just say, do you? Yes.
Yeah.
And then look at the next survey.
Right, and then we'll drill down that one. Okay. And then we actually had that as the next is under childcare questions. We actually considered that potentially a follow-up complimentary survey directed to employees rather than employers. That was one of the questions that we would add to that. This we've already done. Move the questions from Jessica's comments to move those to question 7 as prompts, so that those are the parentheticals at the end. Question 5, move remote work down the priority list. So we had that as number 1. The question is, what type of housing benefits do you offer, if any? So just the ability to work remotely, we just wanted to move that down the list, just to kind of deprioritize it. And then we had a note to change corporate sponsored housing to employer provided housing. A lot of our employers that do provide.
Yeah. I think what you're saying is they may be able to solve their housing problem by having somebody, kind of.
Remote work base.
Yeah, I was thinking it shouldn't be in
We
there.
talked about that at length in outreach. Yeah, that was the stickiest point in the outreach committee about whether we have it in there, whether remote work is a housing solution prescription.
But I think you want to know because it's going to tell you something about the type of and it's also going to tell you something about you're losing the presence of an individual potentially in the county with follow-on expenditures that they have by living in the county if they're living elsewhere, all at the county business. So I think that's a legitimate question
To include.
to.
Yeah, and it was, from my own personal experience, right? I never lived closer to the Berkshire office when I worked there. The entire year that I worked for them, every time I drove 120 miles that day to work there. And a lot of that was because I couldn't find someplace closer that I could afford. So they did allow their employees to work 3 days a week remotely. I wouldn't have been able to work there without that. I wouldn't have been, driving 600 miles a week to go to work. That's a non-starter. So it is, in some ways, it does sort of subsidize employment in a way. So it's more of an employment question than a housing question, really. But I think it's still valuable information to have. Maybe we move it to the employee survey. Just, does your employer offer remote work opportunities?
Are we encouraging the employers to? All if it works for them, it does. If it doesn't, it doesn't. Work for some can't.
I understand what Sarah's saying, but you're trying to get the employers to envision what you want them to say. I don't know if people, I wouldn't be able to make the connection. Because this isn't a job interview.
Right.
I think it is though a way of emphasizing, if my employees can't afford to live here, but I have the kind of business that people can do remotely, I'm still hiring people, but they're not. And I think that's an important data point for us to know about the businesses.
In our housing situation, it's a wash. I just don't see it as a housing benefit. I'm not opposed to asking questions.
I think it is distracting from the whole house.
Okay, let's put a pin in that one, and maybe we just design a different question that includes that as an option. That we'll put on the employee one. We'll figure out how to craft that question. Okay, so we'll put a pin in that one and come back to it, and then we'll circulate that, and we'll ask Tim. Okay. We did want to change in question 5. One of the options is corporate sponsored housing. We're just going to change that to employer sponsored housing or employer provided housing. I know of some businesses that do have some sort of housing arrangement with some of their employees. None of them would describe it as corporate sponsored housing. So
Yeah.
we'll try to, yeah.
But a lot of people know they have their own property.
They can already get,
Yeah.
So.
Brenda had a note that we should circulate this to churches. Churches have like caretaker personnel that live on their properties, so that's sort of employer related housing. But honestly, just to kind of bring churches or religious institutions in general to the table a little bit by using this survey might be a good entry point. Religious institutions are incredibly popular gathering spaces in all communities, and we haven't really had any contact with them. So I think this is a great opportunity for that. Question number 6, which is, what do you see as opportunities for action or collaboration for improving housing affordability overall in Columbia County? We wanted to make some kind of reference here to us, to the task force itself, and what we think the respondents believe the task force should be focusing on. So solicit them for feedback about the direction of our work. And then Michelle asked to add some reference to the effect of the pandemic and how the influence has changed over time. So was there a moment in the recent past where you had a real spike where you had to cut your hours really badly? I mean, obviously we all know that businesses closed temporarily, in some cases permanently. But knowing how that, and to Michelle's point, if that influence has lessened and to what degree it's lessened, or if it hasn't, and what the issues are with responding, bouncing back from the nadir, I guess.
Yes, what sort of tie back to housing questions?
I think it's a question of like, yeah, if it's temporary, like has figures out the height of the pandemic or change. I think obviously we've seen the workforce has changed. I think just more of a trend of what we're seeing in the past 2 years.
I wonder the housing market specifically. Wonder if the housing situation has gotten worse over the last couple of years.
Ask it that way.
Yeah.
Do you think that housing is, we had these issues pre-pandemic, and so just get it off standing or sit like time. Maybe do on a scale, does it, on a scale of 1 to 10, would you say the happening situation is worse than before or better than before, or worse, or on track to improve?
So
Brenda's comment about circulating this to churches, are we capturing all 501(c)s in that? I mean, I think of the number of 501s that are operating in the county that we church-based, but we have a lot of them. I don't know if it's just in a business survey, did we capture that?
yeah, so on the mailing list and distribution list, it's kind of a who's who of the largest employers, and it captures everything. Yeah, so we've got quite a number of nonprofits on there.
Municipalities
Yeah.
on that, right?
Yeah.
How about a question, just ask if the employers think that the county or state is doing enough already for.
Yeah, we can work that into.
Hearing a lot of disgruntlement from some employers about all the unemployment that was paid. Because I just got slammed again with a penalty for unemployment tax.
Okay, so just I'll wordsmith it later. I'm not gonna do it now, but just had a question. Yeah, just related to do you feel that local state government?
I think you should give the employers a chance to say, look, I already think that they're doing enough.
I'm not following. You're talking about the employee.
Employers, they do this other program, doing enough already. Affordable housing.
For housing.
Yeah, that can just sort of fit in the subset under the. What
I mean, they're not gonna know what Eddie's about. We're just, you are, we have a one-page.
Right.
Find out from the employer.
How housing is impacted.
Right, an explanation that goes with this, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, yeah, so you're not just gonna pop this.
Yeah, it won't just show up unbidden and they have no idea what it is. And then we also there was some question too, at first, we were thinking about using social media platforms with the link to the survey. The problem is anybody who's on the Columbia County Chamber of Commerce Instagram page can answer the survey, regardless of their employer or not. So it kind of
Identify themselves and the number of employees, so you're gonna be able to tell.
yeah, I just don't want to get social media bombed with just 1,000 like funny answers. Unlikely to happen. Not something that I want to sift through. So the idea was just do direct mails. Then we'll have that explainer in the email. This is what we're about. And then we'll
Work on a comprehensive plan for community.
Yeah.
Is it gonna be?
Give me numbers.
Then you're gonna know.
Right. It's anonymous, but it came from my email. Okay. Was there anything else that anybody wanted to add for the survey? So we'll incorporate this. Our next outreach is going to be the following Monday, so not the 3rd to 10th. So we'll firm it up then, and we'll send it back to Tim.
I'm just being bugged by this remote work question. I think what you might find is that you might find that there's certain, businesses who, haven't anywhere people gonna work remotely and they're just gonna,
Housing.
right, they're gonna cut housing. And then you're gonna, businesses that, and they're gonna be the ones that all of them are gonna have. And that's why I don't know how much any employees pay, but that is an important question. Or the median salary is kind of impacted by that's high tech salaries, but they don't do here. They just, kind of the business is that's gonna skew from what people actually have to show up in person and live in the county and work in the county. Maybe able to afford to pay. So I think somehow those two are tied together. How much can your employees afford? Do you think? So I think the importance of that.
Yeah, it's just, are we asking the right people, right? Because how much do you think your employees can afford? I think that might be a question better posed to employees. How much can you afford?
Yeah, but you're not necessarily employees on the county.
Not gonna get everybody, no.
No, you're not.
Yeah.
You're not. But employers will know what they pay.
Yeah, don't know. I don't know.
They don't know like people's.
Right.
They don't know like, their mortgage but there's still a very clear cut formula on what rent or housing payment should be. So all of those other factors.
Well, there's a formula.
Yeah.
There's some debate about the efficacy and the accuracy.
Whatever somebody thinks, even if you throw the formula out, being an employer, I think that you want, you have an idea of the workforce you require, and you have an idea of the type of housing that they need. And I guess asking the question maybe helps you think of that. Maybe you're not, maybe.
Right. I think it just clicked for me that I think what you guys are getting at is, can we figure out if employers have a disconnect between their impression of the housing market, what it really is?
They
Right.
think that the affordable rents are out there.
You can get at that answer without including remote work. Or we can get closer to that answer with that. Okay, perfect.
But then there are employees that would be happy to live in one type of home, and then there's the same employee might want to live in a home that costs 3 times as much. So
Sure.
that's a personal choice.
That's
So,
the personal
you know,
Right.
But
Baseline.
the employer disconnect is an interesting
Yeah.
question. I get that.
I've run over our way. I know a couple guys just, they had a roof over their head, it could be a garage.
Yeah. Right.
It was like, they run up and they convex at their camp.
And maybe get
With 8 people in a home, and sharing the expenses, other people want to own 3 homes, so. What is your cost?
I think it'll be interesting to see the total number of surveys you send out and the total number of responses.
Yeah, that's always.
Because you're gonna get the people who really care, and the other ones are gonna say.
Yeah.
got sent several times and got put a catchy email header on it that basically no response needed in capital letters so that they know.
I know.
Actually.
I for one love those emails. I always open those first. Okay, so we'll put a pin in that for now. Great, yeah, make sure anything that threatens you with bad luck, make sure I see that one. So the second portion is going to be the larger piece we're talking about today, which is not news for some folks, or not new for some folks. We've talked about this a little bit. So land bank. I have slides here from a 2018 presentation that Adam Zaranko came down and made. Adam is the executive director of the Albany Land Bank Corporation, and he's also now the president of the New York Land Bank Association, which is a member institution of all the land banks throughout the state, all the participating land banks throughout the state. When Adam came down, so this is 2018, clearly pre-pandemic. Things were a little bit different in the Capital District and certainly in the Hudson Valley. Since this presentation was made, I believe we've added 12 more land banks throughout the state. We are now at 28 land banks of a maximum of 35 that the state will create, will allow. So quite a few more have been created. Many of those are rural land banks. 10 of the 28 land banks throughout the state are now in rural areas, right? I was going through a list of some of the more recently created ones. A few of them have population densities lower than Columbia County. Livingston is the most interesting one. This is just crazy stats. Their population is within 300 of ours, and their population density is the exact same. So that's actually somebody that we should look to for comparisons more often, I think. Livingston, yeah, almost geographically, almost exactly in population wise. Southwest of us. Yeah, so it's southwest. Their largest town, or it's Geneseo, so it's mostly west of us. Yeah, Geneseo is our largest town. It has about the same population density as Hudson, so they're pretty much a 1-to-1. And then obviously the other thing that happened was the pandemic and the housing affordability issues that are related to it, but not entirely caused by it. So a lot of the initial land banks in New York State were formed in response to the 2008-2009 foreclosure crisis. And land banks typically are charged with acquiring vacant, abandoned, and delinquent. They're called bad properties, and delinquent refers to tax delinquent. So the typical tool is used to acquire those properties and get them back on the tax roll. They're acquired usually through some version of the foreclosure process, and this exists differently. And anywhere where there's land bank, they've got a slightly different system for this. But there's been a pivot in the past few years where more land banks are being formed that include in their mission statement and their goals affordable housing, preservation of affordable housing, preservation of existing housing stock, just because so many of the properties really throughout the state are built or pre-war buildings. So there's quite an aging housing stock. And these are all land banks that have been, their applications have been successfully approved, and they aren't really specifically focusing on vacancy, they're focusing on affordability. So just briefly, these are a few of the slides from Adam's presentation. It just gives you what the role of a land bank is as opposed to government intervention in housing and property sales, and then the private sector. So the land bank is kind of, right in the middle. So not a political organization, not for profit, it's 501c3. Most of the funding so far for state land banks has come from the state itself, also from property revenue, the sales of their property. The property sales outcomes, how they're kind of determined, the disposition. Anything a land bank sells gets vetted by their disposition board. And if you've got a community advisory board, which the Albany Land Bank Corporation happens to have, the community has a vote as well. And typically in foreclosure sales, not an issue, never an issue in private sector sales. I shouldn't say never, but very rarely. So the sales process for a land bank is incredibly transparent. Any property that a land bank acquires has to go on their website within the 7 days of their acquisition. And they have to leave all of their sales up for a year after the sale. So there's always this very transparent, very easily available roster of properties they've sold, to who they've sold, what the proposal was for the development of that parcel or not, who the purchaser was, all of these things. These are all right on land bank websites. Is there an opportunity for municipal or community input? Sometimes for the government sales, not really in the private sector. Yes, for land banks. Again, the vetting for the buyers, and then property redevelopment enforcement mechanisms. So these are basically reverters. Reverter clauses are if you purchase a property from a foreclosure list, sometimes that foreclosing governmental unit will add a restriction to the deed that basically states if you don't do what your proposal said you're going to do within the next 3 years, is pretty typical. That foreclosing governmental unit can just take the property back. A lot of municipalities have this, very few of them. But when the land banks sell properties, they all come with that reverter clause. So if someone purchases property from the land bank and they say, I'm going to turn this into 4 units of these beautiful apartments, what have you, and 2 years later, if they've done nothing, the land bank will just take it back, and then they'll just resell it to someone else. The land bank. Every land bank has at least one attorney. It's one of the largest expenses of overhead. It'll go through a court system. Yeah. It's basically a foreclosure. The way that the process is really similar. So that's kind of the overview from Adam's slides. I've got 2 more that I just want to highlight. So this is what a land bank can do. We'll just leave it up there, and you guys all have these in your packets. So it can sell or convey property. It can sell through negotiated sales, convey property for something other than monetary consideration, sell, lease, or manage property, utilize land bank financing tools, and support local planning decisions by adhering to local priorities. Some of the functions are real estate sales, real estate development and rehab, land assembly for development. That's pure land banking. That's property assemblage, trying to get contiguous parcels together for larger developments. Property improvements, demo and rehab. That's mostly what we did in Troy, was rehab properties, do new construction, and we demolished a lot of buildings. Property maintenance, and this is up vacant lots and buildings both. Rental management, we'll put a pin in that one. And then land use planning and economic development. Those aren't really functions of land banks. Those are functions of other organizations, but land banks can play a role along with those organizations. And for what they cannot do, land banks can't impose taxes. Yeah, which one? Yeah.
Would the land bank have in your mind in land use planning?
In land use planning?
Yeah.
It depends on the size of the land bank, right? So Albany has an outsized presence because they've become the de facto disposition arm for all foreclosures in Albany. And in Albany, their foreclosing is a little bit different. The county and the city.
Real property tax
Well, yeah, they can't get at those. No, I mean, they do some work with zombie properties. So in that, there's kind of a tangential sideway in, right? If a bank has told someone they're being foreclosed upon, the person used becomes a zombie property.
Don't have any authority to work with banks on their end of the foreclosure.
Some of them.
Foreclosing.
Right. There's an interesting, it's not on here, but there's a super bid power that land banks have. So if a building is going to tax auction, and it's a building that a bank might happen to have a mortgage on, a lot of times they show up to the auction, they put in a bid, right? Because they don't want to lose whatever that asset is on their books. If a property gets to tax auction that's been foreclosed upon and a land bank puts a bid in, that as long as you're making the county whole for taxes, that bid supersedes all other bids. So if a bank comes in and tries to repurchase the property to keep it on their list, the land bank bid actually supersedes it. Yeah.
Would a land trust have that same right?
This is why land banks so this is one of the reasons that land banks have to be approved by the state, because they come with a collection of powers that are pretty substantial legal powers. And that's one of the biggest ones is the super bid.
They don't, I mean, you make it seem like they're gonna conform to the local municipalities, but you know, we've got a situation where we're just waiting for the governor and the people up in Albany to come down and say, you know, they're gonna supersede something as it is now. So the same power.
Land banks just hold property. Land banks just hold property. So if
They'll sell it to somebody who's gonna do what they
So if
want.
somebody was going to purchase a property from a land bank, would they not be subject to local review?
Are they gonna sell it to somebody who's gonna want it?
That's what how do you define something again, like use claim?
I mean, they're one of the biggest real estate players in some areas, right? Because they hold so many vacant parcels. So just the fact that they have that land means that they've got a seat at the table for planning, because
Zoning.
or just if it's part of planning, you can say, we have this district, right? We've got this amount of parcels, we'll create an overlay district and have that be, the zoning will be whatever the zoning is. And then the underlying zipping is the same.
In a city situation, but most of Columbia County is a very rural community where when you have a property, you're gonna have, 1,000 square foot house on an acre and a half of land someplace and surrounded by other homes similar to that. It's not likely that you're gonna make a collection of those in order to change the neighborhood like you would in a land bank.
Right. I think, and you guys remember when I first came in and we were talking about land banks, if you look at where land banks are designed to work or where they work best, it's places with a lot of disinvestment. So a lot of abandoned properties, a lot of foreclosed properties, and soft markets. Markets where it would cost more to rehab a property than it would be worth when you sold it. So when I first came in, I said, maybe land banks aren't really right here. And then I started looking at what rural land banks are doing, and started looking at the strategies that they're using, that they're still working with vacant, abandoned and delinquent properties, but they've really expanded their scope. Site control becomes really important in really hot markets. And land banks are one of the ways that you can kind of exert a little bit of community controlled site control instead of just whoever happens to have the highest bid on a particular property. But you're right, I think in land use planning, it's much more for land banks that have a high density of properties in a fairly small area.
Not so much of an impact.
No, there are other ways that I think it can have a big impact though. Yeah, that one. Economic development, I think, still though as well, because it could be a commercial property or a mixed use property that it turns into, a property that's in a land bank's profile or portfolio. When it's sold, it doesn't necessarily need to be housing. It could be almost anything.
Could end up with vacant property.
They start with vacant property usually, yeah.
And then they end up, would they be?
The purchaser might, the buyer might, yeah. I can't imagine a land bank itself.
Land bank's got those special powers.
That doesn't mean that they can't, every project that, so for 5 years, I worked both for the planning department in the city of Troy and then was the director of operations for the land bank. We still had to go through that process. I mean, I was the person to talk to. You still had to go through that process. So yeah, they can't avoid local review. That's going to happen for any project they do. So if you look at what you can't do, can't levy taxes, can't enforce codes or laws, absorb more liabilities we can afford. Most businesses can't do that. Change or circumvent zoning or land use laws. Right there, and then solve every vacant property. It's something they can't do, and only work with one category of buyers. That feels like it's specific to Albany. So the last slide from Adams, just a little bit more about land bank's powers. So that just tells you what they are. They're 501c3 nonprofits, and those are the powers that are given to them by the state. The real property is exempt from taxation, as well as special ad valorem levies, special assessments. These are typically things that you would pay at the purchase of a property. You buy for a while when we first started in Troy, we were buying vacant properties for like $250, but then paying $600 and all these extra fees that our lawyer really quickly told us, please stop doing that. You don't have to do it. And then they are designed to create a nimble, accountable, and community-driven approach. And I think the community-driven approach is the really important piece. Having, these all land banks have boards that are appointed by the body that created the land bank. They're created by the governing body of whatever the foreclosing governmental unit is. So in our county, we've got two. We've got the county, and then we've got the city of Hudson, our two FGUs. But a lot of the land banks have created community advisory boards with representatives from all of the towns that like a countywide land bank would touch. So you still have local influence over, who the property gets sold to and what it gets sold for. not as far as dollar amount, but as far as what the developer is. And then the 5 big powers, which is, these are the main reasons why you've got to get permission from the state. You can obtain property at no or low cost through foreclosures, the super bid, which I talked about at the tax foreclosure auction, having land tax free, being able to lease properties out, and then negotiating sales. This one's different for nonprofits. Negotiating sales based not only on the highest bid, but also on outcomes aligned with community needs. So instead of needing to accept the highest and best offer, which nonprofits have to do when they like contract out for professional services, when they're selling properties, they don't necessarily need to take the highest bid if they think somebody else is going to have a greater community impact with whatever their development is. You still have to weigh those two things against each other. You know, you're not going to sell a property for $1 just because you really like whatever the person's plan is. So those are Adam's slides. Any questions on the overview? Michelle?
At number 5, is that negotiating sales when the land bank is purchasing?
Selling. Yeah, that's for selling.
So really, what the land bank is, like a giant parking lot. So that's coming in the closing process, so you don't have, they don't just turn through the closing process and go right back. It's gonna sit in the land bank, they can stay in the land bank until you put together a redevelopment plan you want to see. Maybe you're, there's some subsidies or, you know, if they want to do housing, and then you turn around and sell it and negotiate sales, which is how a municipality does all the time.
Yeah, and the land bank can offer subsidies as well, right? It's a 501c3, so it can apply for all grants and loans that 501c3s are eligible for. We did a couple of, when I was in Troy, we did a couple of JVs, some joint venture projects with different developers. So there were 2 buildings that we worked with Habitat on, the Capital District Habitat for Humanity, and each of those came with $60,000. $30,000 per unit was the subsidy at that point. That was ours. Then Habitat had their own subsidies, and we just split the revenue. I think we made $500 off those deals, which is pretty good in the affordable housing world. It's not bad. Yeah, so you can wait for someone to come to you with a package that includes subsidies or subsidies that they're going to chase, and you can hold up the sale until they get those subsidies, right? So you're not necessarily selling to someone who doesn't have their financials lined up yet. Or what we did in the case of a couple properties, we designed what we wanted to see there, kind of a general sketch, and then asked developers to come in with their proposals. You know, this is what we're looking for. What does your version of this look like? And then we offered the subsidy to the winning proposal.
Understanding the function of this.
Recently had a discussion about the tax foreclosures, and I'm thinking about the topic right now.
I want response from the county board of
Supervisors was that they would
turn right over. They didn't want to see restricted sales, which is actually
this is restricted
We don't know what the County Board of Supervisors response is. We had a conversation with Chris Watts at the county, who is one of the he's a legal counsel that works in the foreclosures there. We've not spoken directly with really any of the supervisors or the board fully at this point. It's certainly a conversation that needs to happen. I mean, they would be the organization that would be responsible for deciding if they want to even create a land bank and then for what that disposition process is. But yeah, we're not.
Said they like getting the extra revenue from it.
I'm going to defer to this. Yeah, we'll get to that.
So yeah, let me answer that quickly. One of the
I think from somebody who's been involved in it for years, and I don't mean to speak for the entire board of supervisors, certainly, but
no, we have been shied away from putting needed restrictions on properties because there's nobody to manage. Okay, Chris's answer of a land bank is that then somebody would manage that. If you sell a conservation easement, CLC manages it. That's an organization that does it, but the county doesn't really have an avenue to do that. So if we said, okay, and I know the city of Hudson's tried this, you know, you got to do this, or we're going to take it back. Somebody has to enforce those covenants, you know. So that's that. Yeah, the county doesn't end up making much money on there. The good thing the county does is get the properties back on the tax rolls, you know, in an active time frame. That's what's been typically happened in the past. Yes, there's a whole new change now that's going to completely turn the foreclosure process on Ted, you know, with having back with money back on somebody. That's another computer thing for another day. So yeah, I mean, it's something we need to have a conversation about, certainly more so, you know, happy for things that, I'm happy to see some other things that a land bank can do, you know, other than just handle foreclosure.
How many foreclosures does the county see in a year? On that, just rough.
It used to be maybe 40 or 50, you know.
I think it would sell. Some of them are just making a piece of solar panel. These properties, you know.
Most of them are sold, you know, to just recoup tax.
$20,000. Sometimes you look at it, you say, well, we're not gonna get somebody to give you a minimum bid of $1,000 on that, you know, once they lose money there, and some other one you might make a few bucks on, you know. Then again, we've never paid a percentage for one before.
Yeah. That's the other part. Yeah. It's like, are you even breaking even? Yeah.
You know.
So that Supreme Court case, and I think we all have maybe mentioned this to each other at some point. So this is Tyler versus Hennepin. Meredith, are you familiar with this one? From your legal? Okay, perfect.
I could get, but I don't think I am.
Little old lady, Miss Tyler. She lived in Hennepin County, Minnesota. She owned a condo, had to go into assisted living. Just went into assisted living, didn't sell the condo, but stopped paying the taxes. So after 3 years, Hennepin County foreclosed on it for the $4,000 that she owed, and then sold it at auction for $44,000 and kept all the money. Her family got on her to hire a lawyer and said, hey, that represents a taking, right, under land use law. And she fought it all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court found in a unanimous decision with this SCOTUS that they upheld her argument. So basically, no foreclosing governmental units when they sell tax foreclosed properties can collect anything more for themselves than the back taxes. Any profit, any delta to that goes to the previous homeowner. So New York's response to that has been when they went back into session last week, the Assembly passed out a foreclosure moratorium. So there's an in-rem moratorium that needs to be signed by the governor still. She's got to the end of the year to sign it, but it's very likely that we'll see, while they figure out how they want to respond to this legislatively, it's very likely that there won't be any more foreclosures. So Columbia County will have a backlog of everything from the pandemic. I think
we have a backlog now. We have a sale going on now.
Didn't pay since 2016.
Got turned over to the county prior to this action.
They're being sold by an auction company now. Actually, already agreed to probably some of that money in escrow, trying to figure out this. I don't know if there's made in that.
That's a real concern.
Yeah,
that's a real concern for existing land banks, right? And especially some of the ways that some of these are set up. Wayne County is the one that I'm most familiar with as far as how they're being impacted, because we know what their numbers are. Wayne County they do all the foreclosure sales for their county, and they keep all of the proceeds. They give nothing back to the county. And they've been bringing in about $800,000 a year that they'll now not be able to get access to, unless the state.
I've watched a lot of properties in the county where you could look at them. I mean, we would usually do a tour there, the supervisors and say, okay,
property $20,000, can you get $20,000 for it? Set a minimum bid, go out and do that. But we used to look at a lot of properties and say, what if you had to and something you could profit margin, a land bank probably has that ability to manage property. At the time,
the county doesn't involved in that. I mean, we just always
you sell it to a developer and let them put it up. Land bank would benefit from that process. And I keep bringing up, in Columbia County, I think we have many more properties that are sitting right over there. When people drive by and see the village property, they think it's a tax foreclosure.
That more like foreclosure rather than property tax.
Yeah, and title issues and figuring out who actually owns properties is also squarely within land bank's wheelhouse. There's a couple of things that they're really good at. I kind of got away from the slides just because we're running short on time. I knew this was gonna happen. But I did want to make sure that I hit one of the things that a lot of the newer, especially the more rural land banks have been doing is partnering with existing housing and community development organizations that are either within their own geographic borders or not too far away. Up in Troy, where I used to be, they run with just one full-time employee, and they contract out a lot of their administrative and property maintenance things to an organization called CEDC, which is an acronym that I don't remember. But there are quite a few land banks that have partnering housing and community development organizations, and that is something that we don't really have in the county, right? We have a rural preservation company that pretty much contains its activities to the city of Hudson. We don't have a neighbor works partner. We don't have anyone that does landlord training. We don't have anyone that does down payment assistance, savings programs, or home buyer counseling. So this is a service whole gap that we've got in the county. And part of the issue is, who would fund that? Like, how would you organize that? How do you start one of these? So land banks, because they're funded so robustly by the state, there was $26 million awarded a few weeks ago. There's still another 23 million or so left in that pot, and then 10 million more for next year. Land banks can bring in those services. So, nearby, not locally, but nearby, we've got Rupco across the river. We've got Hudson River Housing down the river. There's organizations in the Capital District, of course. So there are quite a few organizations that are doing the work that a land bank that's rural and smaller would need to get done, but they would also be bringing in services that don't exist in the county. So there's a bit of an overlap there. Typically, you'll find, depending on the scope of services, these contracts are somewhere in the range of $30,000 to $60,000 a year, but that's all your property maintenance. That's all your title search. That's all your title insurance. It's a variety of services that you get. It's how you can run a nonprofit with just like one or two people.
When typically a situation where a bank takes foreclosures, are they reimbursing taxpayers for the money that was owed? There's no taxes. If there's $10,000 of taxes,
that money come back to the taxing entity? Or is that just a gift?
I mean, eventually, when the building when the property,
That's in the bank thing, right?
yeah, when the property gets redeveloped, and some of the land bank, this is something that exists as part of Article 16, which is the enabling legislation for land banks. Some of them have created these 50 for 5 programs. So if the land bank gets a property through the foreclosure list, or really from wherever they get it from, and they sell it and it goes back on the tax rolls, they split the tax income for 5 years with the municipality. So, there's an argument to me that they're adding more value than was there before. Whether or not they're going to make up whatever that delta is.
right? I mean, to get it back on the tax rolls is benefit to the tax.
Yeah, and kind of one of the ways
But it's not prohibited from paying the county.
they broke down, if this was the average cost that it would take to rehab or do a new build on a vacant parcel, whatever the case may be, typically that was enough where the offset was, it had to be above market rate housing. So yeah, you're recouping like the taxes, but you're creating more of the housing that we don't actually need in the area.
But Chris, it doesn't
How much investment the property just to make it marketable.
Chris,
Michael,
it doesn't prohibit the county from being paid those taxes, and if the property was worth, it adjusts the price of the developer's ultimate total investment, but it wouldn't prohibit, a land bank doesn't prohibit you from either buying it from the county for the outstanding taxes as part of the structure, or paying those taxes either upfront or over time.
County has in the past done directed sales to people that made a specific bid, and if somebody like Habitat was to come and say, hey, we want to buy that property, and and the property, the county sold $15,000, we'll pay that. Sometimes we've done that to directed sales to municipalities or somebody that was going to do something constructive with the property. Yeah, land bank or that type of situation could fit there. I've known of a number of them through the years. Sometimes they're controversial, but sometimes it was always a good reason to want to do this.
But you were always recouping the taxpayers' money.
Yeah.
I look at that, so if the taxpayers in general are owed money, then it's taxpayer money, it's not just county money. It belongs to all the taxpayers.
Now the court case.
Well, I mean, and the court case does say that we can recoup our money. Right.
Right.
Helps you be more definitive about just getting the.
It's not, right.
It's not.
Because I-
All the time, then,
To point out that, right. Foreclosures aren't the only way that land banks can get properties, right? They can get properties the same way they get any property. It's just, it tends to be 90% of the properties in New York land banks were acquired through foreclosure. And 38% of those properties were demolished. Fun land bank numbers. Oh, Mike.
Chris, could you touch on the timing that we're looking at with only
Yes.
eight land bank licenses approved that are left?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, now 7, so there's 7 left. So you can apply to create a land bank at any time in the year. It doesn't matter when you do that. That requires an ordinance or a resolution or a local law by the foreclosing governmental unit. So it would be the Board of Supervisors here and the City Council if the city wanted to form an intergovernmental agreement, because you can't, if there was a Columbia County land bank, it couldn't include Hudson unless there was an intergovernmental agreement between the two foreclosing governments. So you can apply for that anytime. There's usually about a 6 to 8 week turnaround time from when your application goes in to when it gets approved. Once you're approved, there's a pot of money set aside for brand new land banks. So any land bank created after January 30th of this year can access this separate pot of money. And that's between $100,000 and $200,000 per year for the first 3 years of the land bank. Following that, there will be another RFA this fall, most likely mid to late September. That'll stay open for about 6 weeks. That's going to be the remainder of the $50 million for this year, less than 26 that was given to the land banks about 4 weeks ago or so. So there's about 24 million left in that pot. The timing of this is we would have to, for the actual structure of it, first, we would have to do a presentation and get recommended out of the County Economic Development Committee, which meets after the full Board of Supervisors. So the next Economic Development Committee meeting is July 24th. That would be in advance of an August 9th Board of Supervisors full board meeting, which would be the earliest that a resolution could be passed, which means an application would go in on August 10th. And then the extra pot of money or the remaining pot of money would be available about a month and a half after that. So that's pretty tight. But again, you can form the land bank, or you can get the application in whenever, as soon as that resolution is created. The lift on the Board of Supervisors end is you guys got to appoint the board members. That's on you. Boards can range anywhere from 5 to 15 members. 15 sounds like way too many for us. But there's, that's the timing of it. It takes about 8 weeks to get the application, turn it around, and then we have about 3 weeks of meetings here at the county, and then you've got about another 6 weeks before that next round of funding becomes available. Now, there's some question, and Michelle and I met with some folks from the Center for Community Progress. They're one of the technical experts nationwide, and also really big proponents of land banks. But they've also done a lot of work how land banks and community land trusts can function in the same area, and how they create this virtuous cycle of property acquisition and disposition. Then that property remains affordable forever. So basically, if you've got a property that you built 20 affordable homes on, those 20 affordable homes, that's good. You've hit that number. You don't have to worry that in 10 or 15 years you're going to replace those units, right? They're just affordable forever.
Right. But then you're talking. So that I was going to.
That doesn't mean that all the properties are going to go through this circle.
Right. But what if you sell it for affordable housing and you're trying to keep it at that? If the person starts to get above the affordable level, they have to move out.
If someone like buys the house, you're certified when you go through the purchase price, then you own the house.
Right.
So if your income goes up, it's fine, but if you try and resell, there is like a resale restriction, so that you can make an increase, you can build equity based on like inflation at the time you have the house, and you've done improvements, but it's still below market rate. So this way it can then be resold to another affordable homeowner.
No, no.
I'm saying, that doesn't make sense, stay in the house.
That's if someone wants to sell.
Michelle doesn't.
Stay there, but
You're gonna invest in the house, but so. I mean, I've nothing, I mean, if this is for a picture, people say, oh. But you can't say that you're not, that they can, sure, they can stay there, but it doesn't make sense for them to stay there. Because you can't add on to the house and put an addition onto the house, so now you put an addition up to $100,000 or whatever. Because now I can't recoup that, can I? Or what's the board that's gonna tell me, what's the board that tells me that I can do that?
Yes, if any improvement and made to the house, that person, let us keep that equity. The idea is, public subsidy went in this one time, then you want that to be recouped. But if you're putting in your money, you build the addition, whatever, that you just provide the house, you get to keep that part. And then in terms of who kind of makes decisions, like typically the different staff you're governed by, it's like a and then a third is usually general team members, and a third of like government officials. And so you have a balance between people who live on the land and then people who don't, so that you can kind of protect their interests, but also people. So, is that kind of the question? Like,
I mean, I can still see where it's not, and that's the way it is in life too. I mean, there comes a point where maybe it is time to move on. If you're doing well enough, that's right. I mean, I have no problem with it. I just want to. And this is for, you talked about the timeline. Number one, in our last meeting, subcommittee meeting, Brenda mentioned specifically this going to the county government committee. And to me, that's a biggie because
That was the 2018 presentation. That was, so the slides that Adam presented in 2018.
For this whole program.
Or she would have to bring it to that, yeah.
well, that's a balance.
That's a balance.
I know.
Group that
I don't know about development today. But the other thing for me is a member of the task force. I mean, I'm not here to decide for it, right? I don't get all the way to it. But we did ask, I was wondering, how are we making out and getting this structure of how this all works? Things like that. Before I say, yeah, this is great, and you go to the economic development committee and say, well, the whole task force is on board with this. I want to know what it is.
Yeah, we still have to figure that structure out. I mean, some of those questions are for the county, right? Yeah, some of those questions are for them. We can't answer. Why did I bring up the Center for Community?
If the time is to create a land bank,
Which is just really the acquisition and disposition. Kind of made it look for return. We're back to the way, we don't have to be that way. This is what we want to get in, right? To you guys get stake.
Well, CLT, so to be clear, CLTs are, and this is a really important distinction. So the land bank has to be created by a government unit.
Right.
CLT can be created by anybody, right? So you can do both things at the same time. But they're
land developed in the county.
well, 3, yeah, including countywide, yeah. One is quite a bit farther ahead than the others. Has received grant funding and has, a steering committee and all that.
I'll tell you what, we're thinking in our law splits, there's some private individuals just buying up land right and left.
Oh, for sure. That's the only people buying up land.
One sold for $1 million. Ellsworth Kelly Foundation is investing heavily in properties. They have about 50 acres.
I did.
Solar farmers.
Just on the timing piece, the reason I mentioned Center for Community Progress, the conversation we had with them, based on the Supreme Court decision, I asked if those guys thought maybe the funding for land banks would get pushed, right? So maybe not released this fall because the moratorium is in place and the legislature hasn't put together a new kind of new guidelines on foreclosures. So would that pot of money get pushed to the spring? So it's not necessarily we need to get this done as soon as possible if we're going to do it. There's some time, but it's just that is the timeline, right? So that would be the minimum time. I've got 5:11. Does anybody have any final thoughts? Nope. Not yet.
Waiting on these guys to come up. They're going to draft a plan of how it all works. Within the plan.
What's that?
We're ready to apply.
I want to see how it's gonna work. I mean, I just.
Yeah,
I think one of
I
the-
started putting a business plan and a budget together. Mike's asked me to put together about a 1 to 3 page presentation, for county officials. So we'll bring that to the group.
Staff, isn't that, it's 350,000?
Yeah, when we were fully up and running, but that was when we had a lot of properties. Yeah.
I'm just saying,
So that comes from what the,
10 million or so. And how much are the 10, what are these, what are they getting? You say there's 10 million. 20 million.
there's.
I think they're still writing checks right and left. We can't keep up over here.
What are the amounts that individual land banks are getting?
The average, Wayne County, what did they get?
Wayne County didn't get a ton. I think in the last round they got about I think maybe they got $500,000. Go ahead, Mike.
I thought we got this 20.
It's,
Mike.
I think that, I agree with Tim that we really have to see how this thing, would play out, how it works. Not every land bank seems to function the same way. Some, are, more, aggressive perhaps than others. I think it's important to look at, primarily at this point for 2 reasons. One is, unless the legislature expanded the program, there are only 7 opportunities left. The other is that with this in rem foreclosure Supreme Court decision, it's not clear whether that will generate greater interest in land banks and up the demand for the 7 existing remaining licenses, or whether it will change how land banks work, because as Chris pointed out, in some places where they made their money to be able to function beyond the state grant program was by converting in rem foreclosure proceeds into land bank revenues. So I do think we need to look at it in a definitive way. I think we want to be sure that whatever powers that a land bank has, that it's consistent with home rule, and that it's consistent with how people in the individual towns want to conduct the planning and zoning function. And I think that, I don't know that if a land bank is created and it has certain statutory powers at the state level, that the organizer or the municipality setting it up can restrict those. So we do have to look at this more carefully. Chris and I did have some contact both with the local government clinic at the Albany Law School, and I think someone gave us, we had some contact with 2 attorneys. I don't remember where they were from, Chris, but I think we need to really have a presentation that gives us the opportunity to address some of these concerns and see how they can be addressed, or whether they are obstacles to moving forward. But we need to do that, I think, in an organized and functional way, so that we don't miss out on the opportunity because we didn't make the decision soon enough. I'd rather make the decision not to than to miss the opportunity of wanting to do it a year from now and find out that we were too late.
The awards were all over. 90,000 was the Southwest, someplace on Long Island, and then 4 of the land banks got 1.8 million. So it's all over. It depends on how big your.
And Chris, what did Sullivan County get? It was like incredible.
Sullivan County got. Yeah, I have a list here. Sullivan County was one of the 1.8.
Yeah, and I mean, they're kind of our size.
Yep. I looked at County's actual application to become a land bank, because they're the most recently approved land bank. They were the ones that really kind of flipped my switch on this, because they're all about affordable housing. They're super rural, and they had a really well-developed kind of pipeline system where they were going to vet properties on the foreclosure list at the county level with county officials and with land bank board members. And then once they figured out which properties they were interested in, then they went to the towns and asked the towns if they would be interested in the land bank acquiring the parcel for, you know, whatever reason they wanted to acquire it. And then the town makes the request to the county, which is similar to something that we've talked a little bit about potentially working here.
That makes a lot of
Yeah,
sense.
I really like the way that they set that up. And their land bank, their land bank is actually a part of an existing nonprofit, sort of. So they had a Pride of Ticonderoga nonprofit that started off just in Ticonderoga in Essex County. Over the past 30 years has kind of spread to take on the whole county. So they were the ones that the county applied to create the land bank, but it was always understood that would be in partnership with Pride of Ticonderoga. So their staff is the land bank staff, separate board of directors. But they have a really good framework for how a rural land bank could operate. So we're going to learn from them what we can. Yeah, they're
This number 35, and yeah, I mean, I know you don't have a crystal ball. Where the number come
it
from?
used to be 26. So they used to only allow 26 was the cap.
Why is it capped?
I'm not sure why it's capped. I think they're trying to encourage land banks to be formed by bigger. Yeah, and I think they want some of them to combine forces. Like there's a greater Mohawk Valley land bank that service it's 5 or 6 counties. It's the largest geographic land bank in the country, not the state. So I think the state is looking for, you know, kind of larger land banks. I think Troy might be the smallest land bank geography-wise in the state, and they're trying to get away from that. They would like to see bigger organizations that have more capacity.
Michelle, you have a sense of where the city's going with this? Are they actually involved in this? Do they want to do their own foreclosures in the future? I know there's been a lot of talk about affordable housing. There's wonderful things there, but I don't know what they're, because they are their own foreclosure entity. I don't know where they're going with it.
Yeah, it's a good question because we have so few. Like we've had one in the past 3 or 4 years.
The court wouldn't let us do anything for a long time, but
Like, we haven't had one. So I think we have to just like look at the details of like what would be needed like as a contribution, what would like that benefit be. And I think there's like a general attitude of, you know, if this is like beneficial, there's like a lot of other teams that we talked about besides just handling foreclosures. I think it's something that it would be enough. I think there's like a general attitude on the council, like let's try and just, you know, look at what other housing solutions are. So I think an intergovernmental agreement would be a possibility. I haven't spoken to the councils against before. I think if we have more of the details, like who's governing this, like the budget, understanding those pieces, I think that could be a possibility.
That doesn't need to be sorted out at the outset. So you can bring in.
Is it working? And again, I keep seeing this as, you know, even though
City Hudson
certainly within the county, but we've got 2 different, you know.
Yeah, to me, out in the county, your real big area of opportunity is picking up vacant parcels and just doing new builds. In the city,
Those pieces are vacant land, you know, almost unbuildable.
yeah, I really see, and I think Essex is getting into this too. You know, because one of the key phrases that comes up a lot in the land bank literature at the state level. So they've got the vacant, abandoned, and delinquent descriptor. Then they also use the phrase underutilized, and Essex really ran with that. They said this is underutilized because it doesn't have infrastructure, right? So they just they use underutilized as sort of the leverage for, well, we're going to do interventions in these types of parcels because we can use land bank funding for the acquisition, but also for all the site prep, right? Like all your seeker, all your environmental. So they're going to go that route with it, and I think that makes sense too. So there's quite a bit to learn from those guys. All right, any public comments? All right.
The only comment I have, Chris, and my apologies to the people who are on the Zoom call. That CEDC's got to spend some more money and improve the audio visual here, and we will. I apologize. It was I don't think any of us really heard more than snippets of anyone's sentences, but we will address that and get some technical assistance to get this AV system resolved. I really apologize.
It worked last month.
Did, so yeah, I'm not sure what the issue is. There's potential that the recording will be easier to understand because it's recording my screen. So that'll be up on our YouTube channel and I'll post that link. We'll circulate that. So Keith, Harry, Marcia, and Michael. Perfect.
More than any of those. Can I go forward?
All right, thanks, everybody.
Thank you.